Tim Parham, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Oh, fantastic. No, thanks for having me. I've been a long time listener, so yeah, good to be involved and appreciate the invite. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's always a struggle when it comes to lining up time zones and pro sports. I appreciate you being flexible and jumping on. But Tim, anyone doesn't know who you are, would you mind just giving us a 1-2 minute brief background to you and how you've got to where you've got to?
Yep. So I currently work in AFL. I'm head of player health at Adelaide Football Club. But just backtracking from that, my initial sort of course of study was in human movement, exercise, sports science, which I absolutely loved. My initial intent was to get into PE teaching, and I worked out within sort of a couple of weeks of studying teaching that wasn't for me. So I took a bit of time off, actually got stuck into some postgrad study in clinical rehab, which I absolutely loved. And from there, on the advice of a few sort of mentors and people I really respected, got stuck into physiotherapy. I suppose with the backdrop of exercise and sports science and some postgrad experience in rehab, I've really come to appreciate that, the interplay between the two, I suppose, sciences. And I was very lucky in the early stages of my career to work at a really progressive private practice here in Adelaide, with some good links to, some key or collaboration with some key sporting clubs here in Adelaide. So, which range from Tennis Australia to netball, to lacrosse, and some second tier football with the SNFL here in Adelaide. I suppose in 2011 I had an opportunity that presented itself to move to Sydney and be involved with the Greater Western Sydney AFL team, which were slated to come into the competition in 2012, and that was the high performance manager there was John Quinn, who in AFL circles was sort of regarded as a bit of the godfather of sports science. And it was an opportunity to sort of sink my teeth in full time into that space. And I sort of really enjoyed my time at Sydney, a new club, working with some great people, John Quinn, Lockie Wilmot, Nick Walsh, a real sort of mixed bag of experiences, in that it's very rare to be starting a sporting club from scratch. So as hard as some of those instances were, it was an unbelievable sort of learning experience. And I suppose from there, another opportunity presented itself to move back to Adelaide, working with Darren Burgess at Port Adelaide, of which it was a sort of natural fit. Philosophically, I really gelled with Darren from the get-go. And I was at Port Adelaide for a bit, and then in 2018 moved to the UK and took up a role with Arsenal, as a head of rehabilitation, or the rehabilitation coordinator for the first team. And now I find myself back here in 2021, moved back to Adelaide, and working for the Adelaide Football Club. And for those not familiar, that's the sort of the team across the road from Port Adelaide, so the sort of arch rival. So, sort of heading up the physio department there, but again, probably leaning a lot on that sort of, that link between medical and high performance.
What was the culture shock? Was it a culture shock coming to London from Adelaide?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, certainly busier. If you've ever spent any time in Adelaide, it's like often cops a bit of ridicule for being a big country town, but I think the biggest contrast for me was in the actual sport itself and the culture around the sport. I suppose
talk to us a little bit about that, Tim, because I'm really interested to know.
Yeah, so I mean, upon reflection, one of the things I probably wasn't prepared for was kind of just how homogenous AFL is. And I'd been lucky enough to work at two clubs, but I had a really strong impression that those two clubs were very similar personalities, similar culture around training, methodology, that sort of stuff, gym culture, what game day looks like, what recovery looks like, that sort of stuff. I suppose coming into football, it was the complete opposite. And I think a lot of that just boils down to the different nationalities, the different, I suppose, ideas, opinions, belief systems. And so that was probably the most striking difference early was just those philosophical challenges around what's what and how things are done. And we saw that dynamic within the squad at Arsenal. I think in the first year we had 14 nationalities out of a squad of 28. So to navigate that was certainly challenging. And then also not coming from a football background. Some advice was given to me early days was to actually use that to my advantage, of which I sort of was actually good advice in the end, because as an Australian, unfortunately, you don't have a lot of football credibility, but you do have some runs on the board in the world of sports science, sports medicine, perhaps in the eyes of some. So to that end, I could sort of plead a little bit of ignorance and say, look, I don't sort of care what you think, but this is kind of what I believe as an outsider looking in. So that was sort of one of the challenges as well early, was just finding your groove with different cohorts within that playing group.
So was it 2018 that you came to
Arsenal? Yes.
Yeah, it was probably about that time when there was a bit of an influx of people, especially like in the FA, for example, and I guess you'll know because you'll have dealt with them guys, when it was quite and I think it's pretty carried on since then, that having non-football people coming into football was quite fashionable, and probably still is, and it's become the norm. Whereas maybe a little bit before then, 5, 10, 15 years before then, you had to be to be in football, you were a football guy. But I think with the kind of influences outside of that, I think that's a really good thing, and you were probably one of the guys to be involved who weren't football guys, and like you say, that was probably a benefit a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think so. And I suppose the other thing for my experience there was, and probably one I didn't give a great deal of gravitas to originally, was that I started soon after Arsene finished up at Arsenal. So in that sense, you've also got a football club which is so steeped in traditions, and his fingerprints were everywhere, all over the club. And you see in world sport that those legacies are very hard to, the period of time immediately after is always a challenging one. So that was something as well, which added just another layer of detail to the experience.
Yeah, but the first point that I wanted to put to you, and it kind of maybe fits in with this cultural differences that you have in a club, and specifically the mindsets of players when they're going through a rehab, maybe even a short, medium, long-term rehab, whatever it is. And I kind of put myself in the wannabe player that I was, and where I kind of fit into this cautious versus more aggressive rehabber. But I guess you've dealt with people all on that spectrum. How do you manage those mindsets from the super aggressive guys that just want to kind of go out and push through to the more, probably like me, being the more cautious rehabber? How do you deal with those?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. And I think the first thing you have to lean on is that relationship building and that element of trust, which obviously doesn't happen straight away. I think, and probably speaking a little bit to rehab philosophy, I think, while I've sort of been involved in, some of the pointy-ended discussions around rehab planning and timelines and how we're going to sort of skin the cat, I think, the first thing to point to is a rehab journey should be a collaborative one between player and practitioners. And then the other thing from that is it should be you really want to sort of avoid the conveyor belt approach to rehab, which, I did see a little bit of in football especially. And I think a lot of that comes from, just getting everyone on the same page, giving everyone some buy-in in terms of how the athlete should be managed. and doing that from day one. I sort of, one of my bugbears is when, you have a player that's allocated to a physio, and then, there's this conveyor belt of approach. Then the physio hands it over to the conditioning guys, and the conditioning guys hand it over to the on-field coach, and then it's a very sort of disjointed process. Whereas I feel like, the really good rehab programs we've been able to roll out are ones where there's buy-in with all stakeholders. There's a fair bit of rigor and discussion around management. And probably in answer to your question, in those key conversations from sort of day one, that's when a lot of that know-how and experience, comes to the fore, because ultimately you're dealing with, a stack of experience within your high-performance medical team, and you should really lean on that. And as part of that's probably a good way to strategize. Well, what's our plan of attack here with this athlete? Because we know he may be non-compliant. How do we nudge behaviour to get better buy-in? Or on the flip side, is there anything else that we can throw at him that's a little bit left of centre, because we know this guy enjoys so he's a bit of a lateral thinker, or he's a deep thinker, that sort of stuff. So I think a lot of that starts, with your initial discussions and your initial, I suppose mapping out the rehab pathways is just, trying to all get on the same page from a high-performance medical team. And then importantly, once you have that sort of that rigor within, and that is that you have that one message out. And then when you are engaging with that player right from sort of day zero, to actually have some transparency of plan, and then try and get that buy-in and that collaborative two-way approach. Because I think all too often we get sucked in a little bit as practitioners with our own sort of sense of self-importance within, while working with these athletes. And the big thing for me is often, we're super lucky. We work at the pointy end of a sport, but these guys didn't get here by accident. They got here, because they're bloody good at what they do. They're able to adapt and respond to stimulus quickly, and they're generally pretty robust as a result of that. So to then try and come in and sort of, imprint your way or the highway type methodology just doesn't kind of sit well with me. And I always, sort of thought that, the craft is the almost, equally as important as the science.
One thing that's come up a couple of times, and there's a bit of a contrast here how different clubs do it, and I'd love to hear if you've kind of come across both and which one you'd prefer, where a player gets injured and they would get assigned, especially in bigger clubs where there's multiple members of staff. Probably don't work when there's the smaller teams, but a player would get injured and they're assigned to, like you say, a physio, and that physio would run through that process with them, and they get handed over to a specific person on the other side who runs through them until another point in the process. Or the alternative is that kind of, well, they're not assigned to someone, and it's a kind of availability, and it's mixed up, and maybe it's purposely led that way. So there's different influences. Is there a specific way that you've gone about things? Is there pros and cons of both, or is that something that you've not come across?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is, I'd like to think in terms of, that rollout and how it works amongst, allocated to certain physios and so forth. I mean, it all gets down to me in terms of, and this is the biggest challenge in my mind, is having a high-performance medical staff that all speak like a common language. So touched on a little bit the sort of rigor within and the one message out. I think that's important. But it's that sort of mutual recognition of what stuff looks like, what a progression and regression looks like, how someone is thinking. I suppose I like to be super structured, and at times I've been criticised for that. But for me, sometimes having a really good structure in terms of your rehab plan means that you can have that sort of crossover amongst staff, and I actually think it's fairly healthy to have athletes change hands and let those sort of key practitioners within your staff play their one wood. So an example of that would be, if a physio is taking a lead on a certain athlete and they're deemed to be the lead physio, and they're saying, look, I want to roll out some level 1 force absorption work today. Now, you may not know the sets and reps, you may not know, the exact rollout, but you've got a very sort of, fairly clear understanding of what that looks like, and, and what has preceded that, and also what is going to, what's going to be the next progression. So I think that ability to speak a common language early is super important, and I think it's in some way helps to mitigate that, that sort of the perception of where one athlete is tied to one practitioner. So that's sort of, how I sort of try and navigate that, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah, no, that's fine, mate. It's just something that's come up a couple of times. I thought I'd get your take on it. Another thing that you mentioned there was doing certain things, maybe, and use your phrase, left of centre. If that player is open to that kind of thing or thinks laterally, is there anything that you've done that's been a little bit left of centre that has had really good success? Whether it, I don't know, focus on a specific goal to do X, Y, or Z. Any examples that you could potentially give us?
Not specifically in terms of modalities. I think if you could go down into specifics of that sort of stuff, I tend to subscribe to the fact that more often than not, if a player believes that it's helping them, and it probably is. I think as well, I'm pretty big on not sort of shutting gates on athletes if they want to do something. So if they want to pursue, additional massage, or I think, within reason, you allow some of that to create that sort of two-way sort of partnership in the process. But on a broader sort of perspective, one of the things that works kind of well in AFL is we use some of the long-term rehab injured guys. We use it as a bit of an opportunity, to work on, not only athletic development, that sort of stuff, but having a broader sort of approach to, the individual, and not wanting to get too sensitive about things, but you might look at stuff like cooking classes or additional study, or, is this a 6 or 8 week window where we can do a short course online? Would you like to learn how to cook? Can we help engage you in that sort of process? So as silly as it sounds, sometimes having those left of centre ideas across the rehab, or training off site, or training, in altitude, or in heat and that sort of stuff, can sometimes, just sort of shift the needle a little bit in terms of the buy-in, and I suppose that mutual recognition that it is a two-way sort of process.
Cool. Right. Let's dive into hamstrings, because firstly, everyone's dealing with hamstrings. Everyone loves talking about hamstrings, so let's have a little chat around your kind of philosophy. Understanding and assessing risk, is that something that you are doing on a regular basis? How do you go about this? How's your thinking changed in this? Maybe influence of your time in football, going back to AFL. What's your general consensus when it comes to understanding and assessing risk?
Yeah, obviously a complex one, and one that you do a lot of reading on. It ultimately, and rightly or wrongly, the soft tissue injury status is something you're judged on as a high performance department, certainly in AFL. So yeah, it is one that consumes a fair bit of time, consideration, and reviewing of sort of data. The risk profiling stuff for me is fairly important. We look at athletes who have a history of hamstring injury as being significant. We look at fascicle lengths as a measure, more so just to be another piece of information that we might lean on at various points. And then I suppose in conjunction with that, it's all about your chronic training loads in terms of speed exposure, and then what your exposure looks like in the gym, and your eccentric loading and what that looks like. So we tend to have a fair bit of sort of data underpinning that, certainly in AFL with our sports science staff, and it's always sort of obviously got a lot of objective data, but a lot of it boils down to subjective feedback as well. and guiding sort of discussions in that space.
When it comes to measuring fascicle length, are you getting specialists in to do that or referring out?
Yeah, so we normally get someone in at the club, Ryan Timmins, who does that, and I know a few of the clubs do that. And look, and I'd say this if Ryan was sitting right next to me, it's not something we absolutely hang our hat on, but it might just guide some of our decision making, at various points, and as part of an overall sort of risk profile. So we found that to be handy. I suppose ultimately, training consistency, training load, and consistent eccentric strength dose are your key pillars, I suppose, with that.
Is there any overarching management that you put in place for your guys who have had previous hamstring injuries? Anything that's relatively consistent, or does that vary between athlete to athlete?
It does vary athlete to athlete. One thing we have had a fair bit of success with is, across the week, and we're super lucky in AFL in many respects, we don't have the same fixture congestion that you have in football, say. So your turnaround between games is generally 7 days, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, and very rarely 5 days. So it means you, more often than not, get a really good eccentric stimulus. And you can do that fairly safely at around that sort of match day -3. And so you can hang your hat on that and some consistency of that across your program. For guys who are a little bit more susceptible to hammy injuries or have a history, we tend to double down a little bit in terms of their overall load. We obviously monitor their speed loads and make sure equally that we're not overcooking them, but in addition, we're not undercooking them either, and trying to find a bit of a sweet spot in terms of their chronic training load. But we've had some good success with, and it was a bit of a theory sort of that Craig Parham sort of suggested, which was some microdosing. And, we do a lot of isometric microdosing across the week, sometimes as a segue to training, sometimes in their own time. And, we don't sort of hang our hat on it in isolation, but again, it's just another sort of piece of the puzzle. In terms of our overall program, we tend to really be bullish about, loading in an isometric sense. This is a squad wide, sort of from match day +2, match day -3. We then do our sort of eccentric and supramaximal eccentric stuff. And then generally speaking, we actually use our pre-training window as a bit of a way to sort of, microdose some isometrics and quasi-isometric load in there under the pretense of individual prep or prep to train. But we found that being sort of beneficial across, whenever the guys go on grass, they're actually doing something which, across the course of a week, actually adds up to something reasonably significant. So, yeah, to that end, we've had some reasonable success with that.
When it comes back to size selection, Tim, what does that look like in terms of the microdosing of the quasi-isometrics and isometrics?
It'd be a little bit dependent on sort of their injury history. Are you talking specifically about the guys with the injury history, or the more stuff?
Yeah, we could start there, but I'd love to know the more general group stuff as well.
Yeah,
if you're happy to share, of course.
Yeah, yep. So the guys with sort of more your proximal hammy history, that could be anything from some loaded work on the glute ham machine, some bridge positions, and we're not talking like a full strength session per se. We're talking more around multiple hits of sort of 10 minutes total, so they're in and out reasonably quick. And then broadly speaking, in terms of if the guys were more sort of knee dominant, then that might look like something more knee dominant by way of like a Nordic iso, or some sort of isometric on the hamstring curl when prone, to sort of 30 degrees flexion. But again, it's not a big session. Again, it's using that microdosing philosophy, sometimes twice a day, generally with 6 to 8 hours between bouts, sometimes up to 5 times a week. Whether that's grounded in any overwhelming science, we're not sure, but it might go some way to sort of building some robustness and a bit of foundation.
And from a team perspective, how does that differ at all?
We probably don't go as aggressively with the team. We sort of still across that week surf that sort of that curve a little bit and work from your isometrics early in the week to your quasi isometrics to your eccentrics and supramaximal eccentrics, and your power based work towards the back end of the week. But in terms of exercise selection, I mean, it's pretty much a horses for courses as a global package. Some hip dominant, some knee dominant. Always looking to sort of have this progression regression model that we touched on before, and then in keeping with that, single leg, double leg, hinge patterns and so forth as part of a pretty comprehensive, gym program.
So when it comes to hamstring injuries, what's your general philosophy? How aggressive? Coming back to that cautious rehabber versus aggressive rehabber. You could be the rehabber because you are the rehab guy, I suppose. How aggressive are you? How cautious are you when it comes to your philosophy?
Yeah, I suppose ultimately it's an aggressive approach. I mean, and some of that is, I suppose, marrying up the clinical picture with some experience, and then, everything's always contextual in terms of what the demands of the sport is and the athlete and what the team is demanding at that point in time. So on the whole, I'd like to say I'm fairly aggressive. I always sort of use that mantra that, there's no such thing as a perfect rehab. And if it is perfect for whatever reason, then you've probably taken your time getting there. So, to that end, it's always, we try and get guys going pretty quickly, with exception based on clinical picture, obviously. But, try and up the ante in terms of the return to play. And I suppose a lot of that is just born out of, some success and some failures, but certainly some success in getting guys to play probably earlier than anticipated.
So in terms of the aggression of that approach, what does that look like? What aspects of that timeline are more aggressive than you'd maybe see elsewhere or you've done previously?
Yeah, so I think like in terms of a garden variety hamstring, and again, it's such a broad area, and there's so many sort of mitigating factors around clinical picture. But in terms of your sort of garden variety hamstring, your sort of 3 to 4 weeker, generally try and get guys with some isometric load in at sort of day 3 and some more aggressive global load on day 3 or 4. And generally speaking, try and get them on grass, sort of running by about day 5 at the latest, if we can. And that's sort of something that, actually in football, everyone's reasonably aggressive and progressive with. I think that early return to run, return to movement is a pretty commonly held sort of thing. I think the other thing to break down, and again, it probably touches on, your relationship with the athlete and that sort of stuff, is education and why we want to load and navigating pain and navigating discomfort and trying to sort of, educate and upskill the athlete as to, as to why stuff's important early when perhaps the inclination is to maybe do less rather than more.
Do them isometrics that you mentioned on day 3, is that a common thread throughout in terms of using isometrics, whatever form that is, or do they kind of stay at the front end and progress?
They're a bit of a mainstay throughout, and a lot will depend on, where you sort of layer them into your program. Often that would be more of a, I hate using the term, but like an activation as a bit of a mainstay throughout the program, with the more sort of top end eccentric stuff sort of post session and keeping them out of harm's way in terms of what they're going to do on ground. So that they are a bit of a mainstay, but certainly early they're a nice way to sort of gauge an athlete's level of discomfort, but also being able to get some therapeutic load into those sort of key areas and targeted load for that matter.
We had Jack Hickey write a nice Q&A piece for Sportsmith quite a while ago, actually, and he spoke about the introduction of high intensity eccentrics and how we can be, again, using this aggressive kind of theme throughout this podcast, how aggressive we can be with that. How early are you programming high intensity eccentrics in? I know there's lots of nuance in there in terms of player and type of injury, but when it comes to hammies, how early are you getting those in there?
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to that progression regression model and what you've had eyes on what they've been able to do and what they've been able to tolerate. So in keeping with that, I mean, generally pretty early, and whether that it can take different forms. We find that if someone's a more of a knee dominant sort of distal hamstring, there actually is scope to do some more progressive, reactive, eccentric work. At the proximal end, and you might layer that in, as soon as day 10 or day 12, if they're tracking fantastically well. It is a horses for courses thing. And again, you want to make sure that in my view, they've tolerated a reasonable amount of eccentric load, in a controlled sense first, obviously, and then before layering in some of that sort of higher level stuff. Nice.
And I won't keep referencing Sportsmith articles, I promise. But we had one from Simon Harries at the N-Swiss. Was he at GWS with you, by the way, Simon?
No, we didn't cross paths, but okay. He came sort of after the fact, and yeah.
Okay, because he wrote a nice piece on return to running framework, and this kind of feeds into this chat. And I just wondered if you had something similar that you kind of use a bit of a guide to get people from injury day one to throughout that running progressions and back out onto the pitch. I know that in terms of hammies that happens pretty quickly, but I suppose a more global approach to return to running.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I try and layer in with the running stuff is actually have like a quality focus, and one of my bugbears is the first run for whoever it may be being very long, slow, protracted walk jog, low quality running, and as a general theme we try and layer in some running mech, even if it's some ankling or dribbling, at day 3, day 4, some tempo running as soon as possible, and then once you've sort of got that 2 or 3 runs under your belt, try and move towards more some periodization models around intensive, extensive exposure and bookending your sort of more high speed exposure across the week. I suppose one of the things I took from football, which I really thought was done exceptionally well, was the ebb and flow across the week. I suppose one of the criticisms I have of AFL is they train at one speed and it's flat out, and it's always one speed, and some of that's cultural. Whereas I think in football, there's probably a greater understanding of, you work on different days, and, you have your key loading days and you have your more intensive days and your extensive days and so forth. So I've been trying to, sort of bring some of that into the rehab methodology as well, and having days where, they're low volume but high density in terms of your intensive metrics, and that's certainly been something that I haven't seen a heap of in AFL, because it is such a hybrid extensive sport. It's a lot about high speed and sprint, but teasing out some of those more intensive metrics I think is really important. Axel decel, explosive distance, and these sort of more quaint intensive metrics I think is really important. And then equal to that, as soon as possible, I do see, a great benefit in therapeutic high-speed running. And as a general principle, try and layer in lots of that early and often, I suppose. So, Yeah, that's probably the framework I sort of work to. I always go back to what a typical game looks like, what a worst case scenario looks like in terms of that particular athlete, and sort of work back from that, not being afraid to at various points. And if you have the luxury of being able to do so, is build a good body of work in that the sort of top end sprint stuff, and trying to, where possible, get a lot of that contextual sort of sprint exposure in your rehab sessions. So rather than running pole to pole, cone to cone, try and create it within a drill scenario, try and get it in a position specific scenario, and then try and get your sprint efforts and sprint distances replicating what a game would look like.
Did you come up against any resistance in terms of implementing that more ebb and flow throughout the week in terms of a rehab versus the go?
Yeah, a little bit, mainly because it was for some sort of more established athletes, it was a bit of a new philosophy, and I've worked with coaches or managers previous that, rehab has sort of been lambasted because they don't look like they're working hard, and you got to flog them in rehab, and that sort of old adage of he's in rehab because it's easy, that sort of stuff. Whereas I don't sort of subscribe to any of that. So there's a bit of that old school sort of I suppose an old school sort of theory that there's probably embedded in the sport a little bit. And yeah, for some of your more established athletes, I think, that's been something to sort of, educate and navigate. But for the most part, it's been pretty well received.
Did you find that, I know you only had, you had 3 years at Arsenal. Did you find that in football in the UK as well? And I listened to a couple of podcasts, and maybe the old school managers get referenced a little bit more than the young guys, but like keeping people at the physio room, because it's kind of as soon as they go in there, there's a mentality of pain, of kind of down regulation, all this kind of stuff, which I just think is, personally, I think is absolute bullshit. But is that something that you found in the UK as well?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. The one thing I was, super, which was super impressive, is we had some really good practitioners there. Jordan Rees, Chris Morgan, who's now at Liverpool. Jordan's still at Arsenal. Tom Allen's head of sports science, and their sort of agenda was really about, getting guys moving, and pushing the envelope, definitely. But equal to that, I think there was a real, one thing, whether it's new or old or something we did, but we tried to sort of be really transparent about what a plan looked like. And I think with that, you could actually roll out to coaching staff and so forth, what a week looks like. And especially for the athlete, they know when the key work days are, when the rest days are, when the opportunities are to be on the table, and equal to that, when they should not be in there, they should be out, in the gym or working. So having a fair bit of transparency of process, I think, is super important and helps to sort of challenge that a little bit. And yeah, I'd like to think that we did a pretty good job of that.
Nice. One thing I spoke to Phil Glasgow and Nicole van Dijk at Irish Rugby about was this rise in calf injuries, and it was David Breen as well. He'd presented something on the isometrics course, Alex Natera, about the increase in calf injuries in rugby union, specifically Irish rugby in the provinces. Is that something that you're finding in AFL as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think by the numbers, it's certainly increased, and I think the last sort of 3 to 5 years there's been a marked increase in games missed because of calf injuries. What you'd attribute that to, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the dynamics of the game have become, they seem to increase every year in terms of, physical outputs on game day. But yeah, we have certainly seen an increase in that, and some of that is probably coupled with our understanding of calf injuries a little bit more as well. I think in the last sort of 10 years, I think we've become better at deducing, what's significant, what's not. So we've certainly in AFL circles seen something very similar.
Do you go through the same kind of rigorous process in terms of assessing those that are potentially at risk of calf injuries like you do with hammies, or maybe not quite there, or need to be there?
Yeah, probably not to the same rigor, I wouldn't have thought. I mean, philosophically, I think some of what we have, and I'm talking as a collective, I think we've moved away from is perhaps, the nuts and bolts in terms of calf strength foundation work in both a horizontal and vertical plane. So I think, without sort of hanging shit on any one particular genre of practitioner, but I think we've been seduced a little bit into the power plyo side of things, and maybe there is a case that we need to perhaps regress a little bit and spend a bit more time on the strength foundation, qualities. But yeah, it's in a nutshell, it's hard in terms of the profiling. We do a little bit with forced X and some isometric surveillance. We do some very crude sort of strength endurance testing, and then obviously all your RSI testing and that sort of stuff to try and, develop a bit of a picture of that.
What are you doing when it comes to injury surveillance on forced plates? Is that something you can share?
Yeah, we do baseline single leg sort of, Soleus test in terms of max force efforts. We have our counter movement jump, drop jump is an assessment that we lean on. So that sort of fits in with some of our profiling in that space. And then probably, in equal to that, we tend to go down the path of, again, microdosing a fair bit of isometric load, primarily targeting sort of low calf soleus, because that seems to be the ones that are most debilitating for us in AFL, and then ensuring that we're getting enough horizontal load as well. I think it's something that is probably missed a little bit, is that ability to propulse horizontally. So a lot of prowler marches and sled pulls and all that sort of stuff. It's been pretty important.
Nice, mate. Well, that's all I've got for you, and I'm keen to kind of let you get on with your evening. But thank you very much for coming on. Really do appreciate it. If there's anyone out there that wants to get in touch with you, talk about anything career-wise or anything that we've chatted about today or anything else, where's the best place?
Yeah, I'm not overly prolific in Twitter, but I'll definitely get, go backwards and forth on Twitter. I think it's at Tim Parham is my handle.
Got there first, Tim.
Sorry?
You got in there first.
I did, yeah. And then I suppose the other one is just, flick me an email, or it's tparham@afc.com.au, and happy to sort of go backwards and forth.
Legend. Like I say, I'm going to let you get back on with your evening, but I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much for your openness about all the things we've chatted about, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Nice one. Thanks for having me. Appreciate the chat, and keep up the good work.
Perfect. Thanks, Tim. Cheers, mate.
Cheers, mate.